107.9 FM, W300D, Macon, and WDDO, AM, Macon.
The views expressed on this program are not necessarily the views of the Glory 9 PM, the Glory Media Group, LLC, WDDO, its staff, management, or advertisers, but are the views and opinions of the participants of the broadcast.
It is now time for the live broadcast of the NAACP with Gwenette Westbrooks and Mr. Dumas.
Good evening and welcome to another segment of the NAACP Truth Show. I'm Willie Dumas, your host. Joining me today is Ms. Maria Bryant.
Good afternoon.
And we're looking forward to a big show today. Before we get started, I'm going to let Ms. Bryant solicitate a little bit for the organization to give you the information you need to become a member of the NAACP, where you can send those donations and how you can become a part of this great organization. So Ms. Bryant, go ahead and give them that information.
Good afternoon. We're soliciting membership to the Macon of NAACP. If you would like to join the NAACP, we have a youth chapter and we have an adult chapter. If you would you can ask for a application, and you can send it to Macon Bibb NAACP, P.O. Box 6452, Macon, Georgia 31208, or you can call our office at 478-745-9944, and we will send you an application in order for you to join the NAACP. It's only $30 a year for the adults, and it's $10 for the youth. So please join us and be a freedom fighter for the NAACP.
Absolutely. We can use everyone's help. Also, Ms. Bryant, I had an inquiry about what is the age for a youth? What's the youngest age for a youth?
Oh, we take a youth at 6 years old because we had one little girl, she started when she was 4 or 5 years old. But you can, youth goes up to age 21. And then after 21, you're an adult. But we take the young children, we start training them up when they're small. And Then that way, train them up to be great. By the time they get to be 21, they're some great freedom fighters. So,
absolutely, because everybody needs to be in the fight for justice, equality, through education, community service, and all the different areas that we find ourselves having to deal with. I know you and I today, we've been in court earlier this morning. I decided to dress up a little bit for the show today, simply because we were in court today. We want to talk today primarily about evictions. People talked about evictions when the moratorium had run out, and it became, a big subject, a few months back in 2021. But the effects of those evictions are yet ongoing. There are people every day being evicted, losing their homes, as well as losing their apartments and those kinds of things. So we want to get into some of the things that we deal with as it relates to evictions and how the community is affected by those things. And so, today in particular, we were in court, and even before then, this weekend, we had a
workshop this weekend.
Yes, and if you could tell our listening audience a little bit about that workshop and how things kind of transpired and some of the issues that came about.
Well, the workshop was, we were bringing in people so we can have a conversation. They can explain to us what's going on at their different locations, and we were explaining to them. We had forms for them to fill out, and if you had issues with your landlord, now one thing we do try to emphasize is to make sure that everything that you do it in writing. If you have a conversation with your landlord, make sure it's in writing. If the landlord calls you, make sure whatever they give you, make sure they document everything, because anybody can say he said, she said. So what we're saying is, and in a lot of cases, the people we talk to, they talk to the landlord talks to him, but there's no paper trail. So what do they need to do is create a paper trail on all of the information that's going on. That way, you won't forget. Sometimes you have a conversation with somebody, you may forget what they said. She said this, or they can say, I didn't say this. So what we encourage people to do is have a paper trail. Make sure you're documenting everything, and whoever you talk to, write down who you talk to, get their name and their number, and make sure you get the proper information. And that's what's the main thing we talked about. And there were some people there, and they explained to us what was going on in their various situations.
And we do know that every situation is different.
True.
As it relates to evictions. You have some people who may, for whatever reason, not paid their rent or their mortgage because of some information that they may have gotten early on in the year. People kind of misunderstood the fact that if you had the money to pay, you should have actually paid it. Not that you would just be able to say, hey, because they have this particular program, I'm not going to pay my rent because of COVID-19 and those kinds of things. So a lot of people got caught up in various situations where they probably could have paid their mortgage, but or their rent, and they chose not to simply because they felt they were eligible for the program. But as they later learned, there was some paperwork that had to be submitted.
Correct.
And we did have a gentleman on the show earlier in the year talking about exactly what that paperwork entailed. And so every situation is different, but we want to make sure that people have the right information and they do the correct steps and the correct measures in order to be able to protect their dwelling place.
Correct.
Now, also this morning, we had a particular case we were dealing with where a person was facing eviction, and a lot of people are facing eviction. And as we mentioned earlier, every case is different. But just because you get a notice for eviction, you do want to exercise all your rights as it relates to properly representing yourself as it relates to your eviction. And we found that to be very necessary, particularly in the case we were looking at this morning. We're not going to name the individual, or we're just going to name a few specifics to the case, whereas this individual had been paying their rent, but yet they received an eviction notice. And we felt that was not fair to the individual. If they were making payment, that they should have been able to not be evicted from their premises. And so we were gathering factual information in regards to that, tracking their payments to see if they had made those specific payments. And those are some of the things that our listening audience, if you're going through the possibility of being evicted, that you collect the data necessary to represent yourself in a way that you can prove that you've either paid your rent or how far in the rear you actually are. Because we did notice that in many cases when they receive an eviction notice, the amount of monies that the person has to pay may not match up with what that individual usually pays. And so if the contractual agreement hasn't changed between the tenant and the landlord, then there shouldn't be a discrepancy in the costs. And so those are key factors that you have to make sure you're paying attention to make sure that you're being treated fairly in those particular cases.
Please keep a copy of your current lease. Your current lease, you need to keep a copy of it, put it in a location where you can find it, because in this young lady's case, they had changed how much her rent should be, but her lease didn't say that, but the new one they gave her had a different amount on it. So that's why you need to keep a copy of your updated lease. And also, when you're making a payment, if you don't have access to a copy machine, or you can get whatever you do, take your phone and screenshot your payment when you take it in. Take a copy of it. If you want to screenshot yourself walking in the building, you can, so you'll know what date it is. And make sure on your phone, there's a where you can put the date on there. So screenshot that with the date that you are paying, so they can't say, well, no, you didn't come in that day, I haven't seen you. You have a screenshot. And then if you don't, and try to always get a receipt, but make sure you screenshot a copy of that payment when you take it in to pay. So they can't tell you that you didn't pay when you have a screenshot of, this is what I gave you. And if they can't find it, that's on them. But at least you have a record where you did pay your rent and pay your rent on time.
Right. As you mentioned earlier in the show, if it's not documented, it didn't really happen. So documentation is going to be very important, that you document everything. Of course, our camera phones have been a great help in a lot of situations. We've seen that throughout, various situations that occur. And so use those tools that are at your fingertips, your camera, to make sure that you actually took a picture of the actual payment that you were making, whether that's a money order or a check. And you want to keep those types of items in a ledger sometimes, as far as knowing when you paid, not just the amount you paid, but when you actually paid that amount, so that you have proper proof of payment. Because in the case we dealt with today, there were some discrepancies as to what the manager or the person receiving the funds had said, as opposed to the individual that was actually renting, and what they said as far as payment. And if it's not documented, then it really, it's not going to help.
It didn't happen.
It didn't.
We've
really
been
happen.
told if
Right.
there's no documentation, it didn't happen.
Absolutely.
So let's get it in writing.
Right. And then credibility, comes into play. A lot of times, a manager's word sometimes goes further than the tenant, and that's not always a good thing, because we don't really know a lot of times the moral integrity of either person. And so it becomes, somebody's word against another person. And so we don't want to get in those types of situations. We want to actually know that what we've done, we can actually prove that we've done, because that in that particular case today, that became an issue. But certainly evictions are a major issue across the country, and particularly here locally in the Macon-Bibb area. And so if you are facing eviction, or you have a question that we can answer, feel free to call us here at the radio station. And that number is 478-250-1444. Once again, that number is 478-250-1444. And we'd love to hear your situation, because I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that are possibly facing eviction, simply because they've been served the paperwork. They may not have done their due diligence to look into their particular case and see what their rights are. And we would definitely urge individuals to do that, to make certain they're represented.
Also, if you have a complaint, you can always call our office at 478-745-9944 to register your complaint. And we do have complaint forms that you can fill out. That way we'll be able to help you, but you need to, it helps if you fill out a complaint form, and then we'll know what action we can take. But just our main thing is to make sure you document, make sure, and let's stop having verbal conversations. Make sure everything is in writing. And if somebody tells you something and you're right there in the office, get them to write it down and sign it. That's what they told you that's going to happen. Then that way you won't have to go back months later and say, well, you told me that a month ago. And then they can say, well, no, I didn't. But if it's in writing and they've signed it, then you have some documentation.
Also, evictions are pretty much can affect your credit, and so, if you get an eviction on your record, then it makes it difficult for you to actually
Find
rent from
someplace
someone
else.
else.
Yeah.
And so it's not a small thing. I know a lot of people feel, well, if I'm evicted, I have a place I can go or have someone I can live with until I can get back on my feet. But you have to know the legal implication of what that does as it relates to getting another place to rent. It's going to be harmful. So nobody really wants an eviction on their record. And so if all possible, if you can avoid being evicted, you do want to make sure that happens. So you want to use every recourse available to you to make certain that your rights are protected as it relates to an eviction.
Correct.
And so, as it relates to the seminar this weekend, would you say what percentage of the people were actually dealing with rental type problems as opposed to homeowners? Was it
all of the ones we had today, Saturday was renters.
Okay.
None of them were homeowners.
But that is something that we sometimes overlook, the fact that you don't just have to be a renter to be evicted out of your home. If your home becomes foreclosed and those types of situations, you're still out, have to move out of your home. And so that can be a very serious situation for a family. And I think a lot of times when we talk about, evictions, we look at it kind of prematurely. We look at like an individual, whereas in many cases, evictions involve families.
Yeah, it affects the whole family, because if you have children, now you're in the predicament of finding some place for you and your children to go. And therein lies another problem. You may have to move to another side of town. Therefore, you got to figure out how we're going to handle with the children, or they have to move to the school and everything like that. So there's a lot of things come up, and so, but, in some cases, people are evicted, and it may be a personality problem. Some people just don't want you. You just can't get along with the person that's there, or the homeowner decides, I just don't want you there. And so there we go. So
right, and they have to understand their rights,
right?
Because in a lot of cases, people that rent out their properties, sometimes they're private owners, as opposed to maybe a community housing situation. And so, as you mentioned, sometimes you can have personality clashes where the tenant may have complained about repairs or certain things, and then they find themselves not getting their lease renewed simply because the owner, they have some type of personality conflicts. And so, you have to know your rights as opposed to the landlord's rights as well, because landlords too, have certain rights as it relates to the tenants, because they don't have to renew a lease in many instances. So you have to make sure that you have good relationships many times with those homeowners, because if they decide, well, you're not a good tenant, then that gives them room to not want to renew that lease. And so just knowing a person's rights as it relates to evictions is important as well.
And try to establish, a good working relationship with you, with the owner of the home that you're renting or place, because you may find yourself in a situation where for whatever reason, with illness or whatever, and you may not be able to afford to pay your rent, you get behind. But sometimes there are some landlords, if you talk to them, and especially if you have been a good tenant, they'll try to work with you. But don't just stop paying and then get mad with the the landlord when he tells you have to move. So, it needs to be a good working relationship between the two of you. But,
right. And we faced a lot of the things, a lot of these evictions came about because of COVID-19 and what was taking place. You didn't want to put people out of their homes, and we were already dealing with COVID, and so it made situations worse by
Right.
and that's why some of those laws were put in place to kind of protect or to be empathetic or sympathetic to renters, in that they would not be readily put out of their
Right,
homes
right,
because of
right.
the lack
Right.
of being able to pay. Because as you mentioned, the different circumstances as to why people can't pay their rent.
Right.
They may have been sick,
Mhm.
couldn't go to work, or they may have been laid off because of
Hours get cut.
hours get cut.
So you're not making what you were making before. So, if you go in and talk to the landlord, we're not saying that they always will, but they may try to work with you, especially if you've been a good tenant and you haven't given them any troubles. Some of them will try to work with you.
And right.
Mhm.
And then, don't be that type of renter who is not communicating, because communication is going to be the key,
Mhm.
And don't just assume certain things.
Right.
We've got to get out of the habit of assuming certain information. We need to get the facts as it relates to our situation, but because particularly, when you're talking about your home, that's your sanctuary. That's a place where, your family is, where you sleep every night, and those kind of things. You don't want to jeopardize that environment simply
Right.
by assuming certain things. And so it's going to be important that we,
So
that-
if you're a renter, whether you're renting a private home, private person, or from in the housing complex, like I was saying before, just make sure you document everything. Even with them, make sure you keep a copy of your current lease, and make sure you have all of that. Put it in a safe place so you have that information. Then, if you need it, you're not having to look for it all at one time, or it's here, there, and because it's expensive when you have to go back and try to retrieve all of that information. So your best bet is, get your folder, keep a copy of your receipts and everything. When you get a receipt, and then if you go to the bank and have a check cut at the bank, cut it to the person, to the landlord, or to the person you're renting from. Don't necessarily just get the money for yourself. Have it written out to that person.
right. Because that was some of the issues we talked about earlier today, where you separate those funds that are allocated for rent, and it's easily identified on your ledgers when you're paying a certain amount each month, and you can see that figure each
Right,
month.
right.
That way, it'll be very easy for the courts to see if an increase has been kind of slipped in there, because if you haven't signed a new lease, then you're still obligated to the lease you signed previously.
Right.
And we do know that many landlords now, particularly this year, are actually going up on their rent. I mean, that's across the board. Private renters, they're going up on their rental coverage, and also the same thing can happen in your community housing. But if that happens, you need to see a lease where you're signing
Right.
off for that increase.
Right.
They can't just increase it.
That was one of the issues at the workshop Saturday. There were several people that they were told one thing, they get there and it's another, and they're giving them, you have an apartment, and my rent, they could tell you my rent is $550. Then when you get there, they tell you, oh no, it's $600. Well, it has to be documented. You should sign the lease before you get there, and say, this is what I'm supposed to pay. Then that way, if there's some discrepancy when you get there, like, no, this is the lease, they have to honor the lease because they signed it.
Absolutely. And everything is contractual.
Right.
So when you're looking at contractual agreements, that's between two parties, and so two or more parties. And so if you haven't signed off on it, that puts you at a disadvantage,
Right.
for another person to determine, what your ability to pay is.
Right.
I believe that every person, when you decided to rent or you decided to go into a lease with a private homeowner, that you knew you had to have an idea of affordability, if you could actually afford that particular property. And so you had to look at what they were going to charge you monthly.
You need to be clear.
You need to be very
before
clear.
You pack up and get over there and they tell you, okay, no, we decided, no, before you pack and try to get there, you should have a signed lease.
Absolutely. Because if that's not the case, then, it's a making for disaster. Particularly if you can't afford a certain monthly cost for rent, then chances are, at some point you're going to be unable to keep that up. You're going to be unable to pay, and that would lead to a possible eviction. So the main thing is proper documentation, making sure you know what you're signing, what you're getting into, and also understanding that when you send in a payment, that you separate that payment from other things. When people do money orders, let's say as an example, if you wrote a money order, you went and got a money order for your rent, don't put other items on that along with that money order.
Or if you drawing the money out of the bank, draw just that for the rent, have that separate. So it's not combined with everything. Because you may decide, well, okay, I'm going to get $800. Well, $500 or $600 your rent. So, in order to have clear documentation, you need to just get that amount for the rent. Make sure, and like I said, if you don't have a printer or copy, or you don't have access to a copier, or the landlord that won't make you a copy, go ahead and screenshot it with your phone, because everybody has a smartphone. So you can screenshot that receipt. So you'll have that receipt, your documentation, the day that you give it to the landlord.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And, that way, we can curtail a number of evictions that come about. And, if you're facing eviction, make sure you know your rights. Don't just, take it lying down. If you've been making payments and you can prove that you've been making your payments, make sure that that's documented so that you can actually protect yourself, because particularly this month, February, is probably one of the coldest months in the, as it relates to Georgia. And you certainly would not want to be facing an eviction, in wintry months. And so, it has become a grave concern of the NAACP for the number of eviction cases, particularly coming out of COVID. So many
cases, people calling in, and I mean, they're at their wits' end. They're facing eviction. Where am I going? And we're doing. There's only so much we can do, but please make sure, like you said, if you have your documentation and try to work something out with your landlord. If you can't work something out with your landlord, you may have to find, but we're trying to keep people from being evicted.
Absolutely.
It's no fun to be evicted because you don't have any place to go. You don't have it. And then here comes another rent. You've got to put your belongings in storage if you can't find another apartment. And if you've got that eviction on there, it makes it hard for you to go someplace else, because if you do references, it's going to say, and they pull up your record, it's going to show that you was evicted for not paying your rent.
Right. Well, we've run out of time, but we certainly
You're listening to the live broadcast of the NAACP with Gwenette Westbrooks and Mr. Dumas. Come join us next Monday at 4:00 p.m. on 980 WDDO.
The views expressed on this program are not necessarily the views of the Glory 980 AM, the Glory Media Group, LLC, WDDO AM, its staff, management, or advertisers, but are the views and opinions of the participants of the broadcast.
Celebrate the King, everybody.